Hello, SLS for Justice. First, I'm Juliette Brody. I'm the director of the Mills Legal Clinic and of the Community Law Clinic out in East Palo Alto. And first, I want to say Sherrilyn was a little worried. Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, are we going to get students? And I said, SLS for Justice will turn out Friday, 4 p.m. So thank you so much for doing us proud in that regard. It is an absolute honor to introduce this conversation between Sherrilyn Ifill and David Mills today. Let me start by saying this event is being videotaped, so if anyone has concerns about that, you're on notice. I was supposed to tell you that. I want to first thank the many student groups and law school groups for co-sponsoring and making this event possible. I'll just read them off the poster. The Mills Legal Clinic, of course, the Levin Center for Public Service and Public Interest Law, student groups, ACS, Apilsa, Balsa, SALSA, Women of Stanford Law, and also the Women of Color Collective. So give a round of applause to these who came together to bring this great event to fruition. And I personally want to thank Holly Parrish at the Levin Center, who did all the staff work for making it happen. A lot of work in a little bit of time, and it's come off great. So thank you so much to Holly. I know that if your household is like my household and many households across America, even in the households that try to make social justice and racial justice and the state of America and inequality and the legacies of inequality that still plague us, even in households that try to make that a part of our daily and weekly life, the events of the past few months have made that all the more exquisite and excruciating. And many of us have been having conversations about that with our colleagues, with our children, with our parents, with our neighbors, and with our coworkers. We're engaged in conversation, trying to have dialogue about how to possibly make sense of the events in Ferguson, in Staten Island, and the events like them that are less well known, that are happening still throughout this country. How to make sense of them in the place that holds itself out as the world's greatest democracy and pledges allegiance to the rule of law. And I think many of us in America are trying to have those conversations, but few of us have the opportunity to witness a conversation on that subject between two people so renowned in this field as I have the pleasure of introducing you to this afternoon. Sherrilyn Ifill is the 7th president and director-counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's had that post since 2013. She came to that post after a career in legal academics, being a professor at the University of Maryland Law School, where she not only taught civil procedure and constitutional law and many, many seminars, but she also, I'm proud to say, is a clinical teacher as well, having run an environmental justice clinic and having worked with colleagues at the University of Maryland to really start what has become a national movement in clinical education that we have been a part of here at Stanford on representing formerly incarcerated people in dealing with collateral consequences of crime. Sherrilyn Ifill was part of launching that movement in law schools when she was at the University of Maryland. She started her career after graduating from law school and doing a fellowship at the ACLU. Then she went to the LDF as an assistant counsel. So she started her career there, and now she's there at the helm. And in that capacity, back in the early 90s, she was the architect of the LDF's campaign in the Houston Lawyers Association case that led to the U.S. Supreme Court holding that Title II of the Voting Rights Act did apply to judicial elections, a very, very important decision that Sherrilyn is regarded as the author of, or the author of that campaign. So Sherrilyn has dedicated her career to the issues that she and David are going to discuss today, and we could not be more honored than to. She has one free hour today in her life, and she is spending it with us. You can only imagine what her schedule is like. So thank you so much to Sherrilyn Ifill for joining us. Engaging Sherrilyn in conversation is our own David Mills, who needs, I hope, no or less introduction to this room.
No.
No, okay. David's a lawyer, David's a professor, expert in criminal law, in particular white-collar crime, best known perhaps in recent years at SLS for his work in Threestrikes and Prop 36, known around the country and really around the world as one of the great thinkers and leaders of social justice, lawyering in service of racial justice. I could go on, but I know he wants to get in conversation with Sherrilyn, but every time we get a chance to hear from David, it's a treat. So thank you, David, also for giving your Friday afternoon to sticking around on campus. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to David to chat with Sherrilyn.
So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's really hard to hear yourself. So by way of background, I've been the chairman of LDF for way too long. And when John died and we needed a new director general, there was no one more suited, more responsible, no better candidate than Sherrilyn. And we're really, as a board and as a organization, incredibly lucky to have Sherrilyn. So
thank you.
Welcome to law school. Welcome to California. You need to come here more often.
I will.
We really are a state.
I know.
As much as some of us would like to leave. So I guess I'll start the conversation with the obvious. The last 6 months have seen a dramatic shift in the view and the recognition that African American, particularly African American men, are targeted by the police. Whatever one may think about the targeting and the stop and frisk, etc., which is a separate question, the consequence of that targeting has become manifest. And without regard to any individual case, Sherrilyn, it's really time to reflect and to think forward about what that means, how we got here, why all of a sudden, after all these years of seeing young African men shot, killed, improperly stopped, improperly arrested, subjected to horrific harassment from time to time, why all of a sudden this has become such an important issue, has taken hold in terms of the national consciousness.
So first of all, thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon, for having me, and just really grateful to have the opportunity always to talk to students because, I was in the classroom for 20 years and I miss it, and so this is great. And I'm always shocked when I hear people at Stanford refer to David Mills as our David Mills, because I think of David Mills as our David Mills. To get an hour of David Mills' time and thinking is great for me. So this is a privilege for me to be part of this conversation too. So I think David raises a really interesting question. In September, I had a speech that was planned months before to give in St. Louis. So this was a month after Mike Brown was killed, but the speech had been planned for since the spring. And I went for the speech, and I did a talk or a little conversation with St. Louis Public Radio, and I was asked something like the same question. And it made me actually begin to talk about my first exposure to the issue of police violence against unarmed African-American men. And I described during this radio interview my first exposure to this issue, which happened in New York, where I grew up in Queens, when a boy was shot by a police officer. And in this radio program, I talked about how this affected me. I was 10 when it happened, and the boy was 10. I couldn't remember the boy's name. I remembered the officer's name. I remembered that his name was Shay. I remembered what the story looked like on the cover of the Daily News that was on my parents' coffee table. I remember the children and parents talking about it as we waited for the bus in the morning. I remembered my father talking about it. And I remembered that Officer Shay claimed that this boy had a gun, or that he thought this boy had a gun, that no gun was ever found. And what I remember was that he got off. That's what I remember. So that was a kind of a formational experience for me. I did not grow up with the idea that you ran towards the cops. I did grow up with the idea that there were good cops and bad cops, and that it was possible to have an encounter with a police officer that could end in this way. So I told the story on the radio program, and when I got back to my hotel, someone, for those of you who don't know, I'm kind of addicted to Twitter, so please follow me. I got back to my hotel, and I looked on Twitter, and a listener had tweeted me and said, here's the case you were talking about. This is something I hadn't thought about, I don't want to say my age, but in 40 years, right? So I was 10, I'm 52. Do the math. And they sent me a copy of the story from the paper. And it was true, as I remembered it. The officer's name was Shay. The boy was 10. It happened in Queens, not far from where I lived. The boy was walking with his father on a Saturday morning, and an unmarked car rolled up. Two plainclothes officers came out of the car with their guns drawn and began to chase the father and son. They had no idea who these people were, but it was a black man and his son being chased by these two white people. They didn't identify themselves as cops, and they shot the kid. And then they began to exult and say, we got him, we got him. And they apparently believed that he was a robbery suspect that they had heard about on the radio. And when the precinct commander came, he said, can't you tell he's a kid? And that seemed to be the first time they realized he was a kid. In any case, Officer Shea was one of the few officers who was actually indicted by a grand jury and was acquitted, however, at trial, and later fired by the NYPD. He had a pretty scary record. And actually, that case led to some serious reforms in the NYPD about police officers shooting. So when we talk about how long this has been going on, for me, I can say for 40 years, this has been an issue in my own consciousness. And so the question of well, what is it? And I say this because it's so important for people to know that this is not a new phenomenon. This has been happening. So what's different? Well, first of all, we have social media that allows us to do two things. One, we have videos of actual encounters. I learned about Mike Brown's death because I'm on Twitter. For the first 4 days after Mike Brown was killed, there was really no mainstream media coverage. Until CNN took the story on the Tuesday, he was killed on a Saturday, there were 1 million tweets about it by the time it was on CNN. So if you weren't on Twitter, you kind of missed it the first few days. And what I saw on Twitter was a tweet that said they just killed this guy in the middle of the street. He was unarmed. His hands were up. And I saw it and I said, oh, my God. And then an hour later, and then an hour after that, the tweets were about his body is still in the street. What was making the community crazy was that his body was left there in the street, uncovered. So that's how I started to learn about the event. Then we have some of the cell phone videos that we're seeing of actual encounters. We got to see LeVar Jones shot 4 times by a police officer in South Carolina when he was trying to retrieve his identification from his car, when he was actually following all the commands of the police officer. And then LeVar Jones was not, thankfully, killed, so he's talking during the video. He's saying, why did you shoot me? I'm getting my ID. So we can actually follow the encounter. We've seen the police officers roll up on Tamir Rice, and we've seen that it was, in fact, 2 seconds before they shot him. So the kinds of narrative that used to come before we had this kind of visual proof, was, the person fought back, they ran away, there was all kinds of excuses. And now we've had enough cases in which we have the visual proof to make those kinds of stories very suspect. You remember how powerful it was. Now it seems ridiculous because it was so far away and so grainy. But, the Rodney King video, that was a big deal, right? We wouldn't even consider that a video today. I don't know what we'd consider that. But that seemed a big deal because you could actually see the officers beating him. Well, now it's getting even closer. And I think the moment when we all saw Eric Garner choked to death, 1 minute he was talking, and then he was killed. And we've heard, I've heard Bill O'Reilly, Charles Krauthammer, George W. Bush. This is not a partisan. People said, well, something happened. He was talking, he was alive, and then he was choked, and then he was dead. Somebody's got to be responsible for that. So I think that moment of having this proof, having Twitter, I do believe that the table was already set by the killing of Trayvon Martin. which I think resonated more powerfully than people really realize among young people, because they could understand how that could be them. And because George Zimmerman is such an unlikely and kind of foul character, that the idea that he could take this young man's life and not be accountable for it resonated so powerfully for young people that almost this year became kind of the tipping point that came after Trayvon Martin.
So it's interesting, Sherrilyn, because what you're ascribing the new consciousness to is proof.
Mm-hmm.
Visual or other proof, mostly visual,
Yeah.
available, accessible proof that these events are occurring. So do you really think that it's merely a question of belief, that the larger white community, if you forgive that expression, didn't believe, and now all of a sudden they're forced to believe?
Yes. I believe that, now we could go into whether they should have believed, whether there was in fact enough evidence, right? But first of all, I think that it's we're a very pro-police country in a lot of ways. People want to believe the police, and they should be able to believe the police. So I don't question that motive. But I do think that we have developed two narratives about Black people, and especially Black men, that have been absorbed into our culture. One is a kind of inherent criminality of Black men, so that people will believe things that even are preposterous, and therefore you have to really show them the thing. And secondly is, frankly, a kind of diminution of Black life. And by that I mean that the excessive punitiveness of our criminal justice system is a reflection, in part, of the value that we assign to the people who we think are going to be the subject of this hyper-punitive conduct. And I think that's why the statement Black Lives Matter should not seem provocative at all, because that should be apparent. But it is saying something because it's a recognition that too often the value of Black life is severely diminished in our society. And I think it partly is responsible for the harshness of our criminal justice system, because people understand, if not consciously, unconsciously, who the subjects are going to be who suffer under that system.
It's a unfortunate but probably accurate view of the embedded racism that persists. So, and moving a little bit beyond that, what's our role as LDF? Where do you see ourselves playing a role? Typically, historically, LDF has represented individuals, and we have fought for civil rights since Thurgood, and continue to do so. But where's our role in this particular place in history? Because what you're saying is America is waking up to the reality that Black lives matter, or to put it slightly differently, that there's an attack on Black lives that can't be allowed to continue without some form of intervention, without some change, recognizing the need to reduce criminality, especially violent criminality, but at the same time recognizing we can't abandon our core principles. Where do you see us playing a role?
Well, there's two ways I'd answer that. By virtue of all of us, not just those of us at LDF, but all of us deciding that we're going to be lawyers, right? And this is in some ways what's so exciting and subversive about LDF, right? You have an organization that essentially embraces change through the rule of law, despite the fact that, so this is LDF's 75th year, March 15th will be our 75th anniversary, right? And that embrace happens precisely when the law does not recognize the equality of Black people, doesn't recognize the equality of Charles Hamilton Houston, of Thurgood Marshall, of Spotswood Robinson, of all these great minds that we think about. It's precisely the time that an organization is created embracing the use of law as a means for change. And the fact that all of us have decided to be lawyers means that we also have decided to throw our weight behind the idea of a just system of law. That's what we've decided, right? So people who become lawyers and then say, well, to hell with the legal system, I don't really get it, because I'm like, well, why'd you go to law school? Why'd you do all this? Because essentially what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to work this thing through this means to try and bring justice. So when we see what we've seen over the last year, when you see, let's deal with the moment that we're in right now, right? So if I just start calling out the names, Ezell Ford, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Kajemi Powell, Akai Gurley, and on and on. And that doesn't include the people who were assaulted. It doesn't include Marlene Pinnock, who was punched so severely on the highway here in California. It doesn't include LeVar Jones, who was shot in that truck in South Carolina. And you have all of those instances, particularly of those who were killed. And in every one of those cases, no one has been held responsible. It doesn't matter whether we saw them choked to death. It doesn't matter whether they were a 12-year-old kid with a play gun. It doesn't matter whether it was John Crawford in the Walmart holding a toy sold by Walmart. No one has been held accountable. So we are now at the point where it is a challenge to all of us who have made a decision that we mean to use the rule of law to maintain justice and democracy in our society. So since LDF is an organization founded on the idea of using the law, this is kind of our moment. Because at the end of the day, what we all should want is, we want a just system. We want people to use the legal system. We want the people we represent to have confidence in the legal system. At some point, we're going to get to a tipping point where it's going to become very difficult for us to make that case to our clients. We don't want that. So we think it's really important at this moment for LDF to stand behind the principle that the legal system must work. It must be just, that it's a pillar of our democracy. And when it doesn't work, it undermines our democracy in really critically important ways. You think about the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Devil in the Grove, that won the prize, 2 years ago, about Thurgood Marshall and the Groveland boys case out of Florida, which events that took place actually in the same area that is now Stanford, Florida, where Trayvon Martin was killed. But largely that is about the power of that sheriff, right, to be able to shoot and kill African Americans with impunity. So we've been at this a kind of long time. So I think we have something to bring to the table that's really important. Yes, we litigate cases, and we are just in the process right now of hopefully completing a case against the NYPD that we brought for kind of an analog to the stop and frisk cases that deals with public housing. So yes, there's a litigation component, but there are other components as well. So, for example, one of the things we think is really important and that we have pressed with the Department of Justice, with Eric Holder personally, I have said it to the president as well, is to really talk about how what needs to be changed is the culture of policing. And of course, we all know that policing is largely a local phenomenon, like education and criminal justice. And so you could be playing whack-a-mole. Question always for us then is, well, how do you bring the greatest effect? And every case that LDF brings, that's what we think about. Even if we represent an individual, we represent an individual if we believe that case can leverage something, right, for the greater good. Yes, we represented Oliver Brown, the father of Linda Brown in Brown versus Board of Education, but for a reason, right, because we wanted to leverage that. So one of the things we learned, largely actually out of the Brown experience, is kind of how does change happen? In Brown, which we won in 1954, the Supreme Court said that segregated education was illegal. But many of us know that segregated education in the North did not really start to change until after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So why is that? Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 contains Title VI, which, as you probably know, prohibits the federal government from providing funds to any program that discriminates. And that's when northern schools started desegregating and started busing, which is why I was bused to school in 1968 in Queens, New York. So what we learned from that experience is law is really important, but also money is really important, and is a powerful incentive for change. So beginning the week after Mike Brown was killed, we began talking with the Department of Justice and with various federal agencies about the money that we give to police jurisdictions all over this country. We give more than $500 million, probably close to $1 billion in grants, federal grants, to police departments all over the country. And I'd like them to keep getting the money, but I'd like that money to be contingent on some of the things that we've been talking about for a very long time. Implicit bias training, training in encounters with the mentally ill, training in how to de-escalate violent encounters, body-worn cameras, data that is, that asks questions about the diversity of the police force, data that creates incentives towards police not unholstering their weapon rather than discharging their weapon, crediting low number of arrests rather than high. You can do a lot of stuff with money in terms of the incentives that you create. So one thing we've been doing is looking at that whole grant program and saying, federal government, you got to shape up and play your role in that. And we've been pressing that on a number of fronts. So that's one thing that we think is important for LDF to do. The other thing we think is important for LDF to do is to do what we always try to do, which is to do the full 360, to do a vertical and a horizontal and look at the thing from all the different angles. When we went to Ferguson, we didn't just go to Ferguson with criminal justice attorneys saying, what happened here, hold that officer accountable. We went asking, what happened in this police department? How's that officer going to be held accountable? What's that police department going to look like going forward? What is the situation of African Americans in this community in terms of political representation? What is the educational system that serves Mike Brown's friends? Mike Brown was killed and was, going to college the following week. What was that college about? And what kind of chances did it offer him? What is the employment situation for young men like Mike Brown? Had he lived, and then none of us would know his name? What were his prospects in a place like Ferguson? And so that's what we did. We came with a full 360. And so we've been now moving on a number of fronts. Very interested in the issue of political representation. It's kind of a actually really very interesting phenomenon that we discovered there that we're beginning to work on. And so we always bring that full 360 to it, to not just take the incident, but to say, what does this incident tell us about the condition of minorities in this community? And then what does the condition of minorities in this community tell us about the condition of minorities in the larger community in this country?
So once you get that information, we already know the answer. The condition of minorities in most of the communities in the United States are, putting aside the small cadre of extraordinarily successful minorities, the vast majority are poor, are subjected to the problems of the police, etc., which we've all been discussing. How do you change that culture? I don't see where we're going with this. I mean, I understood where we're going, which is my next question about voting, but I don't see where we're going with this, because unless you can improve the economic plight, I don't know what benefit we're going to get.
I would add two other things to that. So, first thing we discovered in Ferguson, the question I had was, Eric Garner was killed before Mike Brown, right? Eric Garner was killed at the beginning of the summer. And after he was killed, you didn't see protests all over New York City, right? The reaction was a little bit different. And you might ask yourself, why? New York is a place full of activists, and we're there, and, it's a lot of people, very conscious place. Why did Ferguson look like Ferguson and New York look like New York? So a lot of people, you recall in the days after Mike Brown was killed, when we started to learn something about Ferguson, we learned a couple things. One, we learned that the actually second largest source of revenue for the town of Ferguson comes from traffic fines and court costs, that there is basically a kind of a system there. And I was there in Ferguson, and literally if you drive 10 minutes, you drive through 4 different jurisdictions, each with a different speed limit. So getting your speed tickets is a kind of a way of life in St. Louis County. And it's how many of the counties raise their revenue. And so essentially, the county runs itself off of poor people who then have to go to court and don't know how to manage these tickets, and then they're bench warrants when they don't appear and they get arrested. And so it's a whole system which actually was somewhat related to the boiling point that they reached around Mike Brown. That was number one. Number two, we learned that the voter turnout was really low for municipal elections in Ferguson. We learned that the black turnout in the prior municipal election had been 6%, and the white turnout had been 17%. Now, I'm a voting rights attorney, right? So that's like appalling. It's unbelievable. So unbelievable that I said, what the hell? How could that be? Well, it turned out that the federal election, the prior federal election, the turnout had been 58%. So how do you account for that difference? So what we learned was that the municipal elections, and I've done a lot of voting rights litigation in the South, as have many attorneys at LDF, and I've actually never heard of this, that the primary election is held in March, and the general election is held in April, in off years. So first of all, the municipal elections are not designed to have people participate. Then I wanted to know more about the actual political system there. And when you dug deeper, what you learned is that Ferguson has a form of government that's like many suburbs, working class suburbs. Suburbs that are not the green leafy suburbs that you think about when you hear the word suburbs, but actually are suburbs that were created in some part as a result of school desegregation litigation and white flight, but largely contain a population that would need the services of a city, but now they live in these kind of outer ring suburbs. So the form of government in Ferguson. Ferguson has a city council, a 6 or 7 member city council, which is part-time. They receive a stipend of $250 a month. They have a part-time mayor who receives a stipend of $350 a month. The town is essentially run by the town manager, who has the power to hire and fire the police chief, who we all saw on display, and yet who still holds his job despite what we saw, and has the power to nominate those judges I was referring to, who are the judges who preside over this court system with the traffic court. So basically the person who has the power is the town manager, and when you don't have real political power, law enforcement. That's essentially what runs the town. So when we ask ourselves, why didn't people come out on election day, it's because they know that is not a means to power. When we ask ourselves, why did they come out on the street after Mike Brown was killed so powerfully, it's because there is no means to real representative power. There is no real place for voice in Ferguson, and they know it. So the other piece we've been looking at is that. We went down and did some workshops because people wanted to know how to recall elected officials and how to write in elected officials to try to get a handle on their governmental system. But I have maintained that even if they elect new people, I mean, I'm a very nice person and very responsible, but for $350 a month, I'm not going to create like an economic plan for the city. Like, that's not going to happen, right? So whoever they get in there is, they're going to be okay, but they're probably not going to be the person who can create the kind of economic opportunity you're talking about, focus on the educational system. So if this were anywhere else, I was describing this to someone the other day, and they said, well, that sounds like a failed state. Yeah, if this were, in Russia, this would be a failed state, right? There's no real governance structure. So we actually have a really big question about kind of democratic governance that we're getting our hands around. It's one of the conversations I was having with Larry Kramer today about what it means when you begin to get your hands around the real deficiency in democratic government. We're now not just talking about wanting to be represented because there are black people who are on the city council. We're now not just talking about voter turnout. I'm saying if all the voters turned out on that election day, they still would be electing the part-time mayor, the part-time city council in a system in which the person who really holds power is unelected. And so when you ask where we're going, for me, it's first and foremost about really providing people with an opportunity to think about what kind of government they want. And so we're planning some convenings in which we can provide people, by bringing together political scientists and others, with the opportunity to think about how they can change their government. And then it requires a lot of research. It's ballot initiatives, it's charters, it's all that stuff. But to make Ferguson a kind of demonstration, or another community in St. Louis County, a demonstration of that. That's number one. The second piece that I think is huge, David, and we don't have enough time to talk about it, but it's LDF's unfinished business, and it's about housing segregation. Because at the end of the day, LDF won Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, ending racially restrictive covenants, St. Louis County, by the way. And we had a choice of which way to go, education or housing. And, what Thurgood Marshall believed was that we were going to do education and then we were going to do housing. But the resistance, the massive resistance to education desegregation essentially swallowed our work in ways that did not allow us to get to this second piece. But it's vitally important. We literally can no longer afford to be segregated. We can't afford it as a financial matter. We can't afford it as a democratic matter. We can't afford it. And the investments that we put into creating segregated housing, because that's what we did. It didn't just happen because there were mean people who didn't want to live next to black people. We actually created investments. The federal government invested in and required segregated housing until the mid-1960s in a variety of ways. We have never made the investment on the other side to undo that work. Do you all know what I'm talking about when I say the federal government did that? Because I don't like to just throw out lines. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So we've never done the investment on the...
Explain it.
Well, so beginning in 1934, when the federal government started giving mortgage insurance, it first of all required that that mortgage insurance be done on a segregated basis. So you were required to have racially restrictive covenants in a mortgage that was insured by the federal government. 98% of the mortgages provided by the federal government from 1934 to, I think it was 1968 or 72, were to white people. The federal government provided the investments, the funds, the tax credits for the highways that allowed all white suburbs to be created, places like Levittown in New York. This was the policy of the federal government. That's why we needed a Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was passed the week that Martin Luther King was assassinated. That's what all the hubbub was about. It was called the kind of Northern Civil Rights Act. It was a response to what had been decades of practice by the federal government, creating, not just reinforcing the bad, mean people who wanted to segregate, because there were those too. I'm not suggesting that they weren't. But to get it on the massive scale that it became so enshrined in American cities everywhere required the policy and investment of the federal government. So what did we do in 1968? We stopped doing that, which is great. It's wonderful. That's how we do it in America. We discover we did something really bad and we're ready to face it, then we just stop doing it. But it kind of requires a bit more than to stop doing it. And so although the Fair Housing Act requires jurisdictions to affirmatively further fair housing, that's really not been enforced properly. That means that jurisdictions are supposed to take affirmative means and measures to try and undo what was done in the past, to not make zoning decisions, for example, right? And highway siting decisions that perpetuate the segregation that was created in the past. So we're returning to the issue of housing segregation because at the end of the day, we can't afford this. We cannot afford for our grandchildren and your grandchildren to be saying, yes, all the polls show blacks think this way, whites think this way, blacks live here, whites live there. We can't afford it. And so this is the great unfinished business that has to be dealt with.
That's really interesting, actually. I want to turn to a different topic just for a second, although I do think we need to spend a minute, just because I care so much about criminal justice reform. Mm-hmm. We are at a turning point. After let's try to depoliticize this. After the Republicans gave us, this is my depoliticizing.
I was like, where's this going?
After the great movement towards harsh criminal laws and harsh criminal justice enforcement, we are now seeing a almost complete reversal of feelings on this. Mm-hmm. And we're catching ourselves at a great point in time that that really does give rise to the possibility of significant change. Mm-hmm. So where's LDF in that? And then I'm going to ask you, so I'll make this a two-part question. Then I'm going to ask you, where are we on voting rights?
So on the first question, I mean, actually, David, you're a huge leader on this. I mean, the work of the Threestrikes Clinic is hugely important, and in many ways stands as the kind of example of what we can do with this moment that you described, because there's no question that we're in a moment. We're in this, right-left kind of moment where people understand that this is untenable for whatever reasons you choose, whether you think it's financial or whatever, and so there's some opportunity for reversal. And what we need is, we need like 40 times the Threestrikes Clinic. Like we need to, because of the local nature of so much of this, we need so many more projects like that show what can be done to try to reverse this. we worked for, some time around the crack powder sentencing issue and trying to get retroactivity on that. We actually litigated and argued the Sixth Circuit case, which we lost. But we continue to try and leverage what the federal government can do. We love what Attorney General Holder is doing around, smart on crime and really important. I mean, people say, well, I don't think the Obama administration is doing enough. I don't know any other Attorney General who has told or would tell his AUSAs to stop overcharging drug cases. That's just like telling prosecutors to stop overcharging is just not done. So that Holder is doing that is hugely important. But we know that the federal system is small compared to what's happening at the state level. And that's why we need to do more leveraging of this moment. We just got invited to and now are participating in this right-left coalition around criminal justice reform in D.C., precisely for the reason that you described, because there is a moment where we can make some real things happen. The question is, how long does the moment last? And what people need, because we do have a real fear of violence in this country for a variety of reasons. One, because it exists. Two, because we maximize it in the media and all kinds of other ways. And that's why people need to see the examples. They need to see what can you do to actually reverse things. The work around clemency petitions, we're also involved in that as well, to try and get people to see what can happen without the world coming to an end. Now, here's the part that I think is really important. There does also have to be, at the same time, some work around the issue that I raised at the very outset about the narrative about black criminality and the value of black lives. Because, as you know, David, we all live in fear of, the next awful crime that makes people say, oh my gosh, we were wrong, we have to go back in the other direction, right? So, and that can't be it. It can't be that we're in this moment and then something terrible happens. And by the way, that's a lot of U.S. history, right? A lot of our laws come, the federal kidnapping law happens because of the Lindbergh baby. We had some terrible carjackings in the 80s, that became a federal crime. Like that's, so we do respond in that way. But we also feel that there does have to be some foundational work around this issue of who black people are, and particularly black men. And this is something I think that to the extent the president is really committed and serious around his My Brother's Keeper initiative, that's actually an important piece of it, is pushing that narrative to the extent possible in at multiple levels, because there has to be a different story about who people are, and then trying to prolong the moment, trying to make sure that this is not a moment that exists during this presidency or during the time of a particular governor. And so that means really keeping the pressure on right now to do as much as possible so that you have real ambassadors out there who can speak in their own voice about the harms of this system. And I really do believe we are terribly harming ourselves as a society by this over-punitiveness. It's not just the money, it's not just the racial disparities, which are bad enough, but who we're turning ourselves into, and the destruction that we're visiting on families and communities as a result of this also cannot be sustained. And so I think the more people come out of the system and that we equip to be ambassadors who can speak in their own voice about the system, I think that's a huge part of it, too, to kind of keep the movement going forward and sustain it.
So that voting.
So you probably know that we litigated the Shelby case in the United States Supreme Court and lost that case. And I was at a conference last week or 2 weeks ago. We were talking about the post-Shelby moment. And the conversation was about the post-Shelby moment in terms of kind of the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 and preclearance and all the stuff that, is part of the post-Shelby moment. But I actually think the post-Shelby moment is even more dangerous and destabilizing than that. And that is that the post-Shelby moment has ushered in a period in which you can now say that you are trying to keep people from voting and have it not be like disqualifying for you as a leader, as a responsible citizen. When the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2006, we always talk about the vote. It was 98-0 in the Senate and 396-33 in the House. It was like overwhelming, right? So why was that? In that period, no one wanted to be associated with the idea of people not voting or to be on the wrong side of history, or to be connected with the history of voting discrimination in this country. And I think what the Shelby decision did and what Justice Roberts did in essentially saying that history is history and has nothing to do with today, and you may free yourself, you may unmoor yourself from that history, and that you have been stigmatized long enough, I free you, South. And then having the Attorney General of Texas, tweet 2 hours later, we're going ahead with our voter ID, and having the Secretary of State of Florida say we're free and clear now. I mean, the kind of unbridled joy that has ushered in this era in which you can now say, yes, we want to keep certain kinds of people from voting, and that's okay. So that's a huge moment. That's one of these kind of, to me, moments in our democracy that we should be worried about. So yes, our Texas voter ID case was really important. We won that case in the district court, and it's really important because the decision of the district judge in that case is so powerful. When she talks about the unbroken line of voting discrimination in Texas, I mean, when we say unbroken line, I mean it's like LDF's whole history, right? So LDF brought Smith versus Allwright, the case in 1944, challenging the all-white primary. We brought the Nixon case. We've been at this since Texas has been doing it, right? So, and the judge essentially lays it out. She lays it out, and she says, yes, actually, this voter ID law, the strictest voter ID law in the country that requires you to get this government-issued photo ID, that doesn't allow university students to use their state university ID, which they could use 2 years ago, but does allow you to use a concealed gun carry permit, is problematic and is a poll tax, right? So that's powerful to have her say that. Now, what was also powerful was for the Supreme Court to say, yeah, but you can go on and use the voter ID law for this election as they did this past November. So that was disappointing. But that case is on appeal. It will likely go to the Supreme Court. It's going to be another huge moment. It's going to be a moment about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the main tool that we use to litigate under the Voting Rights Act. And it's going to really call the question on where we are at this moment. But we have to actually be looking beyond this litigation because it probably comes as no surprise. I'm not generally expecting good things from the Supreme Court in the civil rights realm. And so we have to begin to look at, further down the road, what do we really want? What kind of universal registration do we want? Do we want online registration? How would we make that happen? We have to actually look at some more vital ways of ensuring the franchise for as many people as possible. And that's what we're doing.
So,
Can we get a couple questions?
No,
No, we can't.
one last question, because it feeds very nicely from the answer you just gave, which is, give us, and nobody here is going to tell anybody, give us your unbridled view of the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow. Well, I think it's very important to recognize that Supreme Courts change. And my job, as the leader of LDF, is to prepare us for what will be a change at some point. We will have a better Supreme Court. And the question, and I say this very seriously, I'm going to come back and answer your question in a second, but I say this, but I want to lay the foundation first to say, we at the end of the day, my job, particularly leading an organization like LDF, remember Brown, right? So Brown happens, it's in the Supreme Court, it's not a slam dunk at all, right? Chief Justice Vinson dies, the president then appoints Earl Warren as the Chief Justice, right? Earl Warren is pretty determined to make this thing happen. He's a master politician, and he's able to work this unanimous opinion. Now, I'm not saying anything about, death or anything, so please don't take that from it. What I mean is that it's not like it's all planned and then it's just going to happen, right? Is that there is a kind of a serendipitous nature to some of this. So what I mean to say is the challenge for me is, what is it we've teed up for that fantastic Supreme Court that will happen someday? I worry more about that than I worry about what are the problems with this Supreme Court. Are we ready? Are we working something through the system that when it gets there is going to be as transformative as Brown was? That being said, I do think that, there are members of this Supreme Court who have very strongly held views about race, and particularly about civil rights law. And I think they've held those views for a long time. I think it was very much on display in the Shelby Voting Rights Act case. I think when you see the aggressive way in which the court has pursued hearing a case under the Fair Housing Act, which they just heard 2 weeks ago, challenging the disparate impact standard under the Fair Housing Act, no split in the circuits, third time in 4 years that the court has taken a case raising this question despite no split in the circuits. I think that there are justices, now it only takes 4 to do that, so the question is, do you have 5? But there are justices who have a very clear view of what they think race is about. And, is it disturbing to me? Yeah, it's disturbing. I mean, because, as I say all the time, there is a way in which, and I remember this teaching law, the hardest law to teach for me was always constitutional law. And maybe even, I didn't teach crim law, but this may be true with crim law too. I'm really a civil procedure person, right? The great thing about civil procedure is no law student comes in thinking they know anything about civil procedure, right? So they know they don't know, right? So you've got them in the palm of your hands, and they may hate it, but they don't know.
You don't know Stanford students. They think they know a lot about.
Oh man, that's funny. That is funny.
It's criminal law they acknowledge they know nothing about.
Oh, that's interesting. Because most students come in and they think they know something about criminal law, and they think they know something about constitutional law because you feel like you've engaged it. And I always, when I taught con law, I would have to remind my students, like, just because you have feelings about something doesn't mean that you know something about it, right? You have a lot of feelings about con law, a lot of feelings about criminal law, but it doesn't mean you know anything about it. So I guess I get worried, to go back to the Supreme Court question, my experience, being a civil rights lawyer for 25 years, is that the issue of race and discrimination is so complex, and that in my time as a litigator and a law professor, I have had to engage psychology, demography, labor economics, history, social science. It's just astonishing. A range of things you have to learn about and know to litigate a voting rights case. I mean, I had to put on expert witness, I had to learn how to do regression analysis. I could put the expert witness on. I had to do demography. I had to know political science. I had to know history. I had to know all this stuff. And I find it very complex. So when I hear some of the justices sometimes in these oral arguments make these kind of flippant remarks as though like everybody just knows what they know, and to sound so expert, about it. I always refer to this case that the human genome case from 2 terms ago, in which Justice Scalia, the patents on the human genome, and Justice Scalia in a concurrence, agreed with the opinion, but only, didn't want to be part of Section 2B or whatever it was, because it was all about molecular biology, he said, and I don't know anything about that, and I don't have any basis to know anything about that. And I thought, well done, yes, indeed. But I wonder, like, when I think about how complex race is, what makes him an expert? What the authority with which so many of them speak about issues of race and criminal justice, and I look at all these cases involving strip searches, and I mean, there's so many complex cases, and the authority with never an admission that I really don't know very much about this. Either from my work history, from my own experience, and so forth. All of the accounts that Supreme Court justices gave of what Thurgood Marshall brought to the conference room. Justice White said he told us what we knew but didn't want to know, right? Was that he brought them things that they did not know. And so I want to champion humility also. Even being a Supreme Court justice, I want to champion it because I'm a lawyer and a litigator. And those of you who want to become litigators, and David certainly knows this, is part of the reason we're so full of ourselves is because we are educators. We walk in there, we know more about the facts, we know more about the law, we believe in that judge, and we want to make our case to the judge to say, this is how you should see this. It's an educative function, the litigation function. And I would like to have the opportunity to educate the judge that I appear before. I would like the judge not to already believe that they know. I would like them to give me a chance to say, no, actually, this is how it works. This is what it looks like in Shelby County, Alabama, where you've never been, right? and which you know nothing about, let me tell you how it really plays out there. And so that's, of course, it's distressing to me, but I find I'm more distressed with things like, not giving deference to the record, because as a litigator, I want to have the opportunity to build my record. And when I've built a record, I want the court to listen to the record. I certainly want them to listen to what the district court said about the record. So that's all I'll say about the Supreme Court.
So I'll take one or two questions, and then our time's up.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. So getting back to what you were saying about housing segregation, when I look at it, it seems like, yes, so much of it comes down to these historical policies.
Yeah.
But there's also this really disturbing concept of white flight. And I've only looked at the numbers where I'm from, which is the suburbs of Maryland, DC, Maryland. But it's kind of like, the percentage of people in an area of black people reaches 20,
Tipping point.
25%. And then you see the percentage of white people start falling at least 10% a decade for decades. And that seems like, something that isn't necessarily policy, it's just inherent racism and bias. And I guess, do you have any suggestions about particular policies that could be used in that type of situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think that the whole tipping point white flight thing is not, it is about racism, but it's not solely that. We so tie the economics to race, right? And always did. I mean, the federal government had, the A, B, C, and D areas, right? And the A area was like whites only, B was like whites and, some other people, the C was, so we actually created an economic structure associated with living around whiteness, which has to be kind of deconstructed also. What you learn is that people want stuff, right? That people want to be around universities, and that they want bike paths, and that people get very clear-minded on the economics. And we haven't yet decided that we want to provide sufficient economic incentives for people to live in integrated neighborhoods. So instead, we kind of just leave it to the market, and then people they follow what is the current course, which is the further you are away from black people, the more value your home is going to have. The question I'm asking is, when will we start to make the investments that we make the economic incentives go the other way, so that you'd be crazy, right, to not buy a house there when the school is fantastic and when it's got all of these amenities and when you get this kind of tax credit for living there and so forth, so on and so forth. And I just don't buy that we can't do it, because whenever we decide we want to do something, we muster, right? We do the GI Bill. It's not that the federal government doesn't invest. They do invest. We created a whole interstate highway system. We invest. The question is, what are we investing in? What do we want the outcome of those investments to be? And I'm suggesting that it's time we recognize the unfinished business of housing segregation.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll end it.
Yeah.
You talked a lot about improvements in communities and voting rights and police awareness to make things tragedies like what happened in Ferguson, Staten Island, and Cleveland, less likely to happen in the first place. But when they do happen, what we've seen happen time and again is that the prosecution, the mechanism we have supposed to hold people to account just doesn't work.
Yep.
So do you or the NAACP-LDF have any proposals or
Yeah. We've very strongly supported in New York and in our engagement with, I testified before the policing task force a few weeks ago. We just do not believe that local prosecutors will hold accountable local police departments. The relationship is it's compromised. There have to be special prosecutors. That should be part of the apparatus of a local jurisdiction, that we know automatically where those cases go. So that, to me, is, without question. I think what's happened over the last year is finally people are paying attention to the grand jury and what's problematic about the grand jury process, which is something that criminal defense attorneys have been talking about forever and ever and ever. And so I think we have some real questions about the grand jury process and how it works and how it might fulfill what I think was its original function. And that's important to kind of reform also. We're really interested also in the whole issue of prosecutorial discretion and the role that prosecutors play, because everyone spends a lot of time focusing on the police because they're right there, and judges because they issue these final decisions. But the actors who have the greatest discretion in the criminal justice system with the greatest consequences are prosecutors. And prosecutors are not like defense attorneys on the other side. Their job is to do justice. So they have to begin to take responsibility for the role that they play in the kinds of disparities that we see or the brokenness that we see where there's no accountability. And so I can't really talk about it on videotape, but we are engaging in some activities to try and really engage prosecutors who recognize that, you know, we're in trouble. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I mean, I think about a place like Baltimore where I've lived for 20 years. We actually have a very good police commissioner right now, Commissioner Batts, who's really making some real efforts and inroads. But, you know, one of the problems that we found in Baltimore with police misconduct is that juries made up of very nice, mostly older ladies, did not believe the police. They didn't believe the police because they'd seen the police lie on their grandkids, on their sons, right in their community. And the result was prosecutors could not get convictions, even of real bad guys who really needed to be locked up. So at the end of the day, what we found was that when you break the system like that, when you have a situation in which the community doesn't even believe they can believe the police, then they work against their own interests because now they will not convict because actually they're doing their job. They always have a reasonable doubt when the police testify. So if we don't fix that system, this is what I mean when I say we are coming up on breaking the whole system. It cannot be sustained anymore at this level. And what is one of the great injustices of white supremacy, because I always feel like I have to say that word because it's, you know, I know it's uncomfortable, but it's real, part of the history of our country, is gaslighting black people into believing that what they see didn't really happen, you know, which is why these videos become so important. It's saying it didn't happen, it really wasn't that way, you know, you're crazy, why don't you believe him, he was probably a criminal anyway. Now we're at the point where, like, people cannot be gaslighted anymore. The truth is the truth. And it's not to say that all black people are angels, it's not to say that there aren't real criminals who need to be dealt with in the criminal justice system. It's not to say that the police don't have reason to be afraid. I was shocked in the midst of all this Ferguson stuff in the beginning of September. You probably don't know this. The Missouri passed a new gun law that allows, I think it allows like teachers and administrators to carry guns, and then reduced the concealed gun carry age from 21 to 19. Which, you know, teenagers and guns, okay. But anyway, the point is that police officers really do fear that whenever they have an encounter, that person could be packing, right? So we play a role in making them afraid too, right? So there are just multiple levels on which, if we don't get our hands around it, the whole thing will be broken. And so your question is well taken. We believe very strongly that the kind of unseen in this is the role of prosecutors, not like just individual prosecutors who are prosecutor bad guys. I don't mean that. I mean the role of prosecutors in exercising their discretion. Prosecutors can stop bad cops. Because when they come with the phony information that you know prosecutors don't have to use, judges count on prosecutors to be the gatekeeper. So they play a really important role that now has to be addressed, and they have to be held responsible for taking on you know, their cadre, their ranks, to do a better job.
Thank you, Karen.
Well, if you're like me, you're ready to just sign up and follow these two leaders anywhere they want to take us. David, who, well, I hope will forgive me for omitting his chairmanship of the LDF board.
I've been trying to admit it for years.
Stop.
And even more, Sherrilyn, for coming here from the East Coast and sharing this remarkable hour with us. We're so indebted to you both. Thank you so much.